Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on book history and the House of Murray, an introduction to 19th century literary society. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us today. I know everyone's getting a bit of a Zoom fatigue these days, but we're really glad that you've taken the time to join us. And just before we kick off properly, I wanted to run through some logistics. So just to let you know, today's webinar is being recorded and the recording is going to be circulated after the webinar. We've got all of you on mute at the moment, but if you're having any technical difficulties with your audio or anything else, we do have people on the background who can answer your questions. So if you have any problems, let us know, and we'll do our best to kind of help you with that. And there's a Q&A function that's enabled for today's webinar. There's a drop-down list in this GoToWebinar, and you can use that to enter any of the questions. Please feel free to enter those questions as they come to you throughout the webinar, or you can leave them towards the end, and we should have plenty of time to answer those for you. So that's being the housekeeping. I just wanted to say again, welcome to everyone to this Adam Matthew digital webinar on book history and the House of Murray. I'm really happy to be celebrating the World Book Day 2021 here with you. And the image on this slide is actually of my colleague Alex, who's an editorial assistant at Adam Matthew and who won last year's costume competition in our office. And as you can see, he drew his costume inspiration from our children's literature and culture collection. And I thought this was very much in the spirit of this day. So this day was chosen by UNESCO as a worldwide celebration of books and reading. And we're so excited to be talking to you today about the House of Murray and 19th century literary society and all things relating to the history of the book. So a little bit about the outline of this session today. In the beginning, I'm just going to start off by talking for about 15 minutes about book history and digital publishing. After that, my colleague Lindsay Gulliver, who's a senior editor at Adam Matthew, will talk for about 20 minutes about the House of Murray and providing us with an introduction to 19th century literary society. And after that, I'll just speak for 5 more minutes. My aim is to cover 5 collections in 5 documents in 5 minutes, just to show you a little bit about how these book history themes go beyond the 19th century literary society and touch on some of the other collections that we've published over the years. And after that, we should have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So the overall running time for the webinar is about 40 to 45 minutes. And Lindsay is going to introduce herself properly when she starts her section. Just a little bit about me before we get started. My name is Laura Blumval. I'm a product specialist and academic outreach at Adam Matthew. I support librarians and faculty members and students make the most out of the collections they already have access to in their teaching and research. And I also have a PhD in English literature from the University of York, and I continue to publish articles on issues that relate to book history in different ways, most recently in a Journal of Modern Literature. And I think this is kind of a really exciting opportunity to me personally to kind of bring my 2 professional lives together in this one webinar. So I'm really excited to be here talking to you today. So in the first section of this webinar, I wanted to talk about the work we do as a digital publisher of archival collections a bit more widely, and especially thinking about what this has to do with book history. So I wanted to start with this quote from Professor Catherine Sutherland from St Anne's College at the University of Oxford. And I came across this on a podcast on digital humanities on BBC Radio 3. And in this podcast, Professor Sutherland says that the digital can perform aspects of the manuscript text that actually print cannot deliver that intimacy with manuscript that digital can. And I wanted to start with this quote because I feel like it speaks to this paradox about the relationship between the digital and the material, which is at the heart of our, um, I guess, talk today. And in many ways, I find this actually quite a provocative statement. So counterintuitively, for someone speaking on behalf of a digital publisher, I wanted to start by talking about the importance of touch and the importance of physical contact. And I think with the current restrictions on physical contact in place, we all have a new appreciation of how important touch is to us as humans, and scholars as well working in the humanities. And I wanted to start with this more personal reflection because I think this issue about intimacy and loss of touch speaks to and extends to how we might approach the importance of the material culture of the book. So what you can see on this video here is footage of the Stationers' Company archive in London. This is the physical archive that we worked with to digitize their book history records in Adam Matthews' literary print culture database. And what you can see here is the physical building itself. You can see the interior space of that building, as well as the physical presence of the book itself. So you can imagine the smell of the book perhaps and its weight, its solidity and its fragility as an object, the sound of the rustle of the pages, which when you interact with the book online and as you turn to the next page may sound like the click of a mouse. If we pay attention to the wider context of the quote that I used before, Professor Sutherland is talking about the way a reader can interact with an author's handwriting in the digital environment. So she says that what the user can do is zoom in very close to Jane Austen's handwriting, closer than the human eye can penetrate without artificial support. So there's a great intimacy created with the manuscripts. And I think there's actually a very interesting point here about the closeness that comes from being able to see small handwriting, the movement of the pen, the crossing out of a paragraph more clearly when it's been magnified through zoom functions. And when we run word searches through handwritten documents with our HTR technology, which I will come back to in a moment, you can see different verbal patterns and linguistic densities and form non-linear connections between text, letters, and other types of writing. So in some ways, what constituted an official index to a physical book is now supplemented in a digital environment by a list of search results, which can be filtered, sorted, and browsed in different ways. So when I speak about the organization of the database supplementing the organization of the book, I think I very much want to emphasize that there's a clear continuity between the physical object of the book and its digital scan in one of our collections. So when the archival material in the collection is assessed and digitized, we have to work with the physical properties of the rare books and manuscripts. So we travel to the archive and we assess material for conservation needs long before the digitization even begins. And some of the typical damage might include damage to the binding, damage from water, fire, or mold, dirts and stains on the page, loose, stuck, or uncut pages, or even pest damage or residue. And in the picture on the left, you can see Lindsay here, who's going to talk to us in a second. And she's practicing some common conservation techniques as part of a training session that was provided to us by the conservation team at the British Library. And conservation assessment is something that we always work really closely with our partner archives. And the photograph on the right-hand side was taken on one of these assessment trips 2 years before the publication of 19th-century Literary Society, showing a page in the John Murray archive where the ink that was probably still wet has been smudged. It has also stained the opposite page, and this is something called offsetting. And the fact that this picture was taken 2 years before publication gives you a little bit of a sense of how much time and care goes into working in this space where the material culture of the book and the digital publishing meet. So it's true that the journey of the physical book to online is very much dictated by the features of the online environments where that digital scan is hosted. But this journey always has been equally, if not more so, dictated by the physical properties of the book itself that is being digitized. And the images you can see here on this slide here is of the Attis book drive, which was used by Max Communications at the National Library of Scotland for the John Murray project, which was used to scan bound items in the archive. And you can see things like there's a 120-degree cradle, which is adjustable to suit different types of binding. It also self-adjusts to keep the spine in a central position throughout digitization, which reduces the amount the book needs to be manually handled during scanning. The setup also has 2 cameras, one to capture each page, so the capture process does not take longer than if you were digitizing a double spread, which again minimizes the number of times an item needs to be handled. So this is different from some of the digitization setups that have only 1 camera, where they will photograph all of the rectos and then go back through and capture all the versos. So the 2-camera setup we had at the National Library of Scotland is really ideal for any projects that include a large proportion of bound items or bound items that are particularly large, fragile, old, or valuable. And while the Yetis book drive would be used to digitize bound books, there's actually a lot of writing we digitize that is not in the form of a printed book. And I've shown 2 examples here of different types of writing media. One is a letter on the left-hand side, written on parchment in July 1452 by Margaret Paston to her husband John, who were part of a gentry family in Norfolk during the War of the Roses, and which we digitized in our medieval family life collection. The other is also a letter, but this time written by a Maori officer on an ivy leaf in France, which we digitized in our First World War database. And if you read a Margaret Paston's letter, it actually ends with a comment saying that paper is dainty, which means that the paper was expensive. And you can see that a part of the paper has been cut off before writing the letter, and that the handwriting gets smaller and closer together as Margaret starts to run out of paper to save it. And I imagine that when the Maori officer of the New Zealand Pioneer Battalion wrote this letter poem on the ivy leaf, he had also run out of paper. But this simple poem written on the delicate skin of an ivy leaf is so fragile, and that it's kind of very incongruous with the images of mud and filth that we associate with trench warfare. And I think its beauty really deserves special notice. And it also really shows the different types of pages of writing that we have to work really carefully with to be able to make them available digitally. And the final aspect I wanted to quickly mention before handing over to my colleague Lindsay is our new handwritten text recognition technology application and how that might change the way we approach book history in a digital environment. So Adam Matthews is actually the first publisher to utilize artificial intelligence to offer HTR for its handwritten manuscript collections. And this takes advantage of the latest advances in neural networks and uses complex algorithms to determine probable combinations of characters to find the search term. And this enables relevant handwritten text to be identified at document level, allowing users to easily navigate between highlighted search results. And the example you can see here on this slide is of the poet John Milton's Commonplace book, which we digitized from the British Library in our Early Modern England collection. And this Commonplace book really covers the English Civil War and the period leading up to it, as well as the period of the Commonwealth. And the image here shows a page where I ran a search for the word Parliament, and it's picked it up on this page 6 times in 2 different spellings, which might indicate a separate hand, as Milton also went completely blind during this period, and he had to rely on different people to write for him. But because the HTR relies on probability in its algorithm, that variation in spelling doesn't actually affect its ability to pick up that word. And the reason I wanted to finish my section by talking about HTR is because I think it is a really exciting example of the new things that become possible when the material and the digital come together in the study of book history. And this is everything that I wanted to say in this introduction to this session. And I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Lindsay Gulliver, who's going to introduce herself and talk to us a little bit more detail about our new collection, 19th Century Literary Society.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay. I'm a senior editor in the production department at Adam Matthew, and I was the project lead for 19th Century Literary Society, the John Murray Publishing Archive, which was released last spring. I had the opportunity to work with some wonderful primary source documents over the years, but it was a particular privilege to work on this resource and to discover more about the valuable materials held in this unique archive. So, the historic John Murray collection comprises one of the world's most important literary archives and has been held by the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh since 2006. As a sign of its centrality to book history and the UK's cultural heritage more widely, the archive was added to the UNESCO Memory of the World Register in 2011. That said, while you've definitely heard of the Murray authors, who included Jane Austen, Charles Darwin, and Lord Byron, it's entirely possible that you've never heard of the House of Murray or the family who built the firm. So today, I'm going to introduce the history of the company, talk about their role in 19th century literary society, and I'll also tell you a bit about how this newly digitised archival collection can be used to study book history. The firm was founded in 1768 by John McMurray, a hard-drinking former Marine who dropped the Scottish Mac from his name to better fit into London society, at a point when it was still fairly hostile to immigrants from the north. After marrying well and leaving the Navy, Murray drifted through several occupations and sought opportunities to invest his wife's fortune, fortuitously stumbling across a book-selling business for sale in Fleet Street. Though he had little connection to the industry, Murray famously wrote to a friend, quote, "Many blockheads in the trade are making fortunes," end quote. The implication being that he stood as good a chance as any at success in the literary world. Bookselling at this time was really quite different to the retail world today, and Murray didn't only sell books, but meat and beer and lottery tickets too. Before long, however, he was investing in new titles. I believe his first was Lord Lyttelton's Dialogues of the Dead, and he also bought shares in other titles by Samuel Johnson and Daniel Defoe. He could hardly have known it at the time, as he made those first forays into the trade, but the first John Murray was kickstarting a publishing dynasty that would end up spanning more than 200 years, countless bestsellers, and 7 generations, all named John. Following the death of his father in 1793, the second John Murray took his place at the helm of the publishing firm while still in his teens. Initially, this was a partnership with Samuel Hiley, but later, at the turn of the century, he took on sole responsibility for the growing company. It was under the reign of John Murray II that the firm really blossomed, and he was able to style himself as a gentleman publisher, forming strong relationships with his authors and establishing himself as a well-known figure in literary society. Murray II is closely associated with the famed romantic Lord Byron, but also introduced his own political periodical, the Quarterly Review, which was intended to provide a Tory voice in opposition to the more Whiggish sensibilities of the Edinburgh Review. It proved a huge success and remained in circulation for more than 150 years. The firm would later pass on to his son, the third John Murray, who had a personal fascination with science and forged links with some of the greatest scientific minds of the day. It then passed on to John Murray IV, and so on, until the family firm was finally sold in the early 2000s. Materials included in this new digital resource span the entirety of the long 19th century and document the golden era of the House of Murray from its inception in 1768, focusing predominantly on the tenure of John Murray II and his son John Murray III as they rose to prominence in the publishing trade. The digitised collection includes drafts and proofs of books, but also correspondence between the authors, editors, and their publisher, and then illustrations, financial ledgers, and records of sales too. I can only really scratch the surface today of what the firm achieved throughout the 19th century and beyond, but as a taster, the Murray family published huge blockbuster titles, including Jane Austen's novel Emma, David Livingstone's exploration narrative Missionary Travels, Charles Darwin's groundbreaking text On the Origin of Species, and Lord Byron's epic poem Don Juan. Over the years, the House of Murray worked with some of the best-known authors of the 19th century, including Sir Walter Scott, Washington Irving, and Herman Melville, but also hugely popular authors who are less well known today, such as the best-selling cookery author Maria Rundle, the intrepid travel writer Isabella Bird, and pioneering self-help guru Samuel Smiles. The Murray firm also came into contact with prominent politicians. Papers relating to the Prime Ministers Peel, Disraeli and Gladstone can be found within the collection. Consequently, our new digital resource covers an array of themes in addition to literary history and the publishing business. There's such a wealth of material in this resource, and one of our first concerns when scoping out the features was how to relay the central role that the Murrays played in literary society. We wanted to highlight the interconnected nature of the publishing trade and the impact this had on 19th century culture more widely. The Murrays shaped the books that shaped the world. So we curated a list of 30 figures who are central to the story of the Murray collection. Some are very well known, like Jane Austen, but others less so, like the influential editor of Murray's Quarterly Review, William Gifford. Gifford was known for his sharp reviews, and many believe he was responsible for a vicious review of Keats, which many felt precipitated the poet's death. The true author was actually another Murray reviewer, John Wilson Croker. In addition to themes and document type, this resource includes the ability to browse the documents by key figure, and we also produced a detailed biography feature. This provides really useful context on these figures, but also links related people and specific documents in the collection, which should help newcomers discover the network of literary and social connections running beneath the surface. The interconnectivity of literary society in this era is impossible to ignore. Everywhere we look in this collection, we see strong and often unexpected connections. John Murray II himself held a central position in literary society and enjoyed hosting authors and literary figures at the headquarters of the company in wealthy Mayfair. These daily gatherings came to be known as Murray's 4 o'clock friends. It was at one of Murray's gatherings that Lord Byron was introduced to a Scottish writer who he much admired, Sir Walter Scott. Scott had helped to found Murray's Quarterly Review and, rather wonderfully, was also one of the first reviewers to write about Jane Austen's novel Emma. Though known today for his historical fiction, Scott initially wrote the Waverley novels anonymously, and their authorship was a great mystery of the day. In a fantastic example of the unexpected connections that we find in literary society, a young John Murray III would be present at the dinner where Scott finally revealed himself to be an author of fiction. We know this as he writes about the event in a letter he sent home to his father, a letter which is included in this resource. I was really privileged to visit the National Library of Scotland during the development of this project, to open up the ledgers and letters, and bizarrely, the boxed up carcass of a sea snake too. But the experience which really connected me to this collection and these materials was a visit to the Murray family residence in Mayfair, which served as the home of the business for many, many years, 50 Albemarle Street. With the very kind permission of John Murray VII, we were able to shoot an introductory video to the collection in the parlour, a room which has changed very, very little since the days of the 4 o'clock friends. The materiality of the room, the opulence, it really sets the scene for some of these literary stories, and it proved a perfect platform for David Maclay, the former archivist of the John Murray Archive, to share his expertise. I'd like to play a short clip from the video to give you all a taste of those kind of glamorous surroundings in which the Murrays conducted their publishing relations. So Laura, if you wouldn't mind, could you press play, please?
So these rooms are where Murray authors, critics and readers came together. And it didn't matter what your experience was or what your interest was, this was the melting pot for all the different types of personalities which crossed and crisscrossed London. So here you could find a cookery writer and a children's writer, along with a self-help writer, a scientist, a politician, each of them with a one common link, Murray. Murray and his other authors, and here you could debate and discuss and learn from each other. So you can imagine being a Murray author, coming to these rooms, you're stepping in the footsteps of so many famous authors who have come here before. It might be Jane Austen, it might be Lord Byron or Walter Scott, or it might be one of the travellers, Livingstone perhaps, or Darwin. With these wonderful premises, Murray was able to entertain. And People enjoyed coming here, of course, for the food and the drink which was supplied, but far more for the nourishment of the intellect. For here you could meet authors of outstanding ability, but also people yet to make their way in the world who would contribute just as actively to the conversations. So famous were these meetings that became known as Murray's 4 o'clock friends, the appointed hour where it would be free for anyone to pop in and rub shoulders with some of the great literary names of the day. And Murray was there hosting all, coordinating all, and making sure that everyone had a good time.
I hope that short clip helped to give you a sense of the glamour of the parlour where Murray and his authors and other members of London's literary society would meet. In many ways, it's changed very little since those 19th century soirees. The eagle-eyed among you may have noticed the fireplace in the background. That fireplace is a historical site in its own right, for as much as the Murrays contributed to literary history, supported authors, and championed books that have stood the test of time, John Murray II was also responsible for one of the greatest literary crimes in history. The John Murray Archive houses the most complete archival collection of their most famous author, the poet Lord Byron. His manuscripts and personal papers are a particular highlight of this new digital resource, passing both literary triumph and personal scandal. It was his scandals, and perhaps the fear of who may be implicated in those scandals or how they could reflect on the firm's reputation, that led John Murray II and several conspirators to gather together following Byron's death and burn the poet's memoirs in the fireplace at Albemarle Street, the very fireplace seen here. So some of my favourite items within the John Murray resource can be found within the Byron Papers, particularly letters and writings relating to his scandalous affair with Lady Caroline Lamb. Much maligned over the years, she was a former flame of Lord Byron and a member of the aristocracy. It was she who famously branded Byron mad, bad, and dangerous to know, and her commonplace books and letters have been digitised as part of the archive's holdings. Looking at Caroline Lamb, we can again see that interconnectedness of society and the way in which all roads seem to lead back to the House of Murray and their authors. Throughout her brief affair with Byron, Caroline remained married to Charles Lamb, or Lord Melbourne, the future Prime Minister and favourite of Queen Victoria. John Murray IV would later earn a knighthood for publishing the Queen's letters. Lord Melbourne was himself implicated in an affair with the campaigner Caroline Norton, whose most famous poem, A Voice from the Factories, was published by the Murrays in 1836. Meanwhile, Melbourne's mother, Elizabeth Lamb, and mother-in-law to Caroline, was a close friend and confidant of Lord Byron, and aunt to Byron's eventual wife, Anne Milbank. If you're getting confused, I really don't blame you. It's not quite 6 degrees of separation, but it really isn't far off, and it's certainly a great indication of how entangled relations could be in the Murrays' world. Returning to the Byron Papers, these make up around 15% of the new online resource, and highlights include personal correspondence tracking the poet's colourful private life, related works that comment on his tragic death and the burning of his memoirs, but also fan mail, financial papers, and annotated proofs of his works, to which I will return very shortly. There can be a tendency sometimes to see a book as an untouched example of literary genius, but through studying book history, we discover how books are shaped and moulded throughout their production. The Murrays had a huge influence on the works they published. As I've already said, they were shaping the books that were helping to shape the world, and were in constant contact with their authors, illustrators, and reviewers. The clearest example of the role the publisher could play can be seen in the story of Charles Darwin's seminal evolutionary text, On the Origin of Species. Darwin approached John Murray III to publish his work on the advice of his friend, fellow Murray author Charles Lyell, and Murray would help to guide Darwin through an arduous publication process, rebuffing advice to shorten the text or to refocus on a central topic like pigeons. It's quite difficult now to imagine whether this book, which changed the way we understood the world, would have had quite the same impact if it had emerged into the market as a treatise on pigeons. Researchers of literary history have a real treasure trove at their fingertips in this new resource. The unparalleled John Murray collection allows for in-depth research into the everyday workings of a successful 19th century publishing house. However, we also really wanted to draw out the array of different sources that can be found in literary archives, and how undergraduate students can use these to study the stories of particular texts, and the different voices and different hands involved in a book's production. To do this, we created a really brilliant informative exhibition in partnership with David Maclay, which we called The Life Cycle of the Book. Students can trace the development of 5 key Murray titles from initial discussions through to final drafts, browsing early advertisements and tracking sales successes across financial papers and ledgers. In addition to Darwin's key text, the exhibitions trace the development of Livingstone's missionary travels, Isabella Bird's writings on Hawaii, and a hugely successful book by the archaeologist Austin Henry Layard, which charted the excavations of Nineveh. Each one of these examples draws out fascinating documents from the book's production. In examining letters from Livingstone to Murray, we learn of his fury at meddling editors and abominable illustrators. Isabella Bird addresses a controversy in a new preface sent to Murray for her next edition. And through sales ledgers and advertisements, we learn about the significant investments made into Layard's book, described by one reviewer as, quote, one of the most remarkable books of our time. The 5th and final exhibition tells the story of the epic poem Don Juan, using letters exchanged by Murray and Byron alongside printed proofs. We look at several stages in the life cycle of this masterpiece and track the difficulties and eventual decline of their working relationship. Throughout his career as a poet, Byron pushed boundaries, skirting close to impropriety with his bawdy humour and literary attacks on public figures. While Murray often wrote simperingly to the aristocratic poet, he was also fearful of the impact that Byron's work could have on his reputation, and fought to temper some of the poet's libelous or offensive words. Byron, in turn, resisted those edits. Indeed, he wrote to his publisher ahead of the release of the poem, and I must say this is one of my favourite quotes from the Byron letters. Quote, you shan't make canticles of my cantos. The poem will please if it is lively, if it is stupid, it will fail, but it will have none of your damned cutting and slashing. So my colleague Laura spoke earlier about how high-spec digitisation can really allow researchers to connect to the materiality of a book, even through a screen and even thousands of miles from the archive. Turning to the edited proofs of the first 2 cantos of Don Juan, this becomes even more apparent. Here we can discern 2 hands at work, the suggestions of Byron's close friend John Cam Hobhouse and Byron's own rebuttals. In one instance, Hobhouse cautions, pray don't, at the poet's incendiary use of language. Byron crosses out this advice. We can zoom in closely on the page and see the 2 different hands. Byron's Y and D are far more ornate than Hobhouse's, which is very clear if we compare the words looked and homily to the crossed out advice from Hobhouse. In another example, we can see exactly how heavy Byron's amendments are. The ink really saturates the paper, and in one place he crosses out a word so frantically that he almost scratches through the surface of the page. And because of the quality of this digital facsimile, we can see that quite clearly. I barely scratched the surface myself of the history of the House of Murray or the tools and features that are included in this new resource, but I do hope I've been able to give you some insight into the gems contained in this unique publishing collection, some of the stories that shed light on social connections in literary society, and the way different types of primary source material can reveal a richer history of a single book. Thank you for listening, and now I'll pass you back to Laura.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was Amazing. So the next section this is going to be very brief, and then we're going to open for questions. So I set myself this challenge of covering 5 more collections in 5 minutes through 5 documents. And I've not set a timer for myself, but I timed it before, and I should be about 5 minutes. So let's get started. So the first collection that I wanted to highlight is Romanticism, Life, Literature and Landscape. And I wanted to start with this because it's in many ways a sister collection to the John Murray Archive, in that if the John Murray Archive is very much there's the Lord Byron at the centre of it, one of the stars of the younger generation of Romantic poets. Romanticism focuses on one of the stars of the older generation of Romantic poets, William Wordsworth. So this is a digitised manuscript collection of the Wordsworth Trust at Dove Cottage in the Lake District, and it documents not only the composition of Wordsworth verse through the annotated full manuscripts of works like the Prelude and Michael, but also the close networks of literary collaboration and influence through the inclusion of manuscripts and correspondence of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Thomas de Quincey, Robert Southey, and Dorothy Wordsworth. And the example document I picked out from this collection, which you can see here, is a really good example of the literary networks that takes place in this collection too. So it's a letter written by Wordsworth to Coleridge in 1798, when they're both in different parts of Germany. But William's letter only actually occupies one of the 4 sides of this folded paper, and the remaining 3 are covered in transcriptions of his recent verse by Dorothy Wordsworth, his sister. And this letter is also significant for including one of the earliest versions of the ice skating episode from the Prelude, and it continues a really fascinating literary and philosophical conversation Wordsworth is having with Coleridge about German poetry. And the next collection is literary print culture. So we saw earlier a little bit of film footage of the Stationers Company Archive, who we partnered with for this collection. The Stationers Company Archive is arguably one of the most important resources for understanding the workings of the early book trade, the printing and publishing community, the establishment of legal requirements for copyright provisions, and the history of bookbinding. And the document you can see here is one of the entry book of copies contained in that resource. And these were really important documents that show the kind of variety of material that was registered for copyright, from books to plays to poetry. And they include some particularly notable works like A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare, John Milton's Paradise Lost, and Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. However, it's also really important for music scholars. So what you can see here on this slide is Mozart's Trio for Pianoforte in the entry book of copies in December 1788. And these provide some indication of the composers that music sellers considered the most marketable. So in these entry book of copies, you can see that English composers like James Hook are entered many times, 149 times, in fact, much more often than works by foreign composers like Haydn, who had 52 registrations, or Mozart, who only had 16. So these are really important for music scholars as well. Third collection, Early Modern England. This is a really rich resource on the lived experience and everyday lives in early modern English society, shedding light on ordinary people as well as prominent families through a wide range of materials like court records, family correspondence, wills, everyday objects, and commonplace books. So I already showed John Milton's commonplace book when I talked about the HTR functionality. But another more literary example from the resource that I want to show you, which is a kind of favorite of mine, is the 1611 edition of Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. So when I did my undergraduate degree originally in English, this was a set text for a Renaissance term. And I think as an undergraduate student, when we talked about the complex topic of reading and the different allegorical levels that operate in the poem, it would have been really amazing to also view an early edition of the text with all of these amazing illustrations, decorative fonts, front pieces, dedications, and other paratextual elements that also changed the way I would approach close reading that text. Okay, 3 done, 2 more to go. Children's literature and culture. This is actually one of my favorite collections. This covers the golden age of children's literature and illustrations, charting how the notion of childhood really evolved from the 1820s to 1920s. It's also really interesting from the point of view of book history, because the selection of material in this collection is really underpinned by the McLaughlin brothers' mechanization of color printing, which really revolutionized the production of children's literature in the 19th century. And the manuscript pages you can see here really speak to some of that mechanization. So I'm sure all of you have used copy and paste and cut and paste functions on your computers. And these terms actually come from manuscript editing, where real scissors and paste were being used. So alphabet books were one of the most common genres to reuse images from already published books by cutting and rearranging the materials to suit the layout of the new page. So the boy playing the violin you can see here was originally from the book Ideal Mother Goose, and this was cut and pasted into the alphabet book. So the boy's name in the original book was Jackie, and this was changed to Zaki to accommodate the always difficult letter Z, while the nursery rhyme basically remained otherwise the same. And I'm always really fascinated by the different lens children's literature can provide to our understanding of book history because of their innovative use of illustration techniques, pop-outs, and other interactive elements. And the final collection I wanted to show you before we open up for the Q&A, food and drink in history. So it might be a bit odd at first, I think, to include a resource documenting the story of food and drink throughout history in a webinar about the history of the book. But actually, historical cookbooks are a really fascinating and different example of this topic. So there are books that offer a particular insight into the domestic world and often provide rare opportunities for women's voices to be heard through their own writing, through descriptive recipes, annotations, notes about what they like or don't like, and they often make changes in a way that shows their agency and opinions. And often these recipe books also include multiple authorship across generations. Some recipe books were handed down through families, perhaps started by a new wife or given by a mother to her daughter, and updated over the years and through generations. And there's also physical evidence to indicate that the recipes were tested, eaten, and returned to on different occasions in the stains, splashes, and other signs of being used in the kitchen. So the mid-19th century recipe book, which you can see here, has clearly had a pot or pan rested on its open pages at some point, which you can see in the mark there. And it's also been marked with crosses against some recipes, which you can also see in this image. And there are occasional comments in this recipe book, such as good beside the recipe for Litchfield donuts and always good above gold and silver cake, which gives you a sense of the types of baked goods that Ambi particularly enjoyed. And that was a really quick whistle-stop tour through 5 other collections beyond 19th century literary society that touch on book history in different ways through different partner archives and different angles and different periods. And I'm sure you're interested in other documents and collections as well that I've not been able to highlight here. So as a treat, we're sharing this free Digitising book history guide with you as well. There would be within the GoToWebinar functions, there should be a dropout that says handout, so you can access this document straight away and have a look at all the other collections that I wasn't able to cover today. So 18th century drama and Perdita manuscripts are 2 of the collections that I didn't get the chance to cover today, for example. And if you have any problems of accessing that handout, please get in touch with us. We're really happy to email it to you as well. And that's everything that we wanted to cover for you today. And we're now open for the Q&A. So there's the questions function in the drop down. Please enter any of your questions, and we're really happy to, both Lindsay and I are very happy to be here and answer any questions that you may have. Okay, so I can see a few questions coming in. Feel free to, we have plenty of time, so feel free to enter any of your questions in the chat. So one of the first questions that I got was about a question about the John Murray Publishing House and whether they're still publishing. Lindsay, would you be happy to unmute yourself and answer that?
Sure, absolutely. It's not a subject I know an awful lot about, I'm afraid, but the family sold the business back in 2002. I believe that was to Hodder, and it's passed hands several times since. It does still live on as an imprint, and I believe one of their recent successes was actually codenamed Villanelle, which is better known to the drama fans as Killing Eve. So they're still kind of producing some real bestsellers.
Amazing. And I'd probably add, I actually have a friend as well who's published by John Murray. Fiona Mosley wrote this novel called The Elmet, which was nominated for the Man Booker Prize, and I recommend you look that book up. So they're very, John Murray's still a very active publishing press, but what we focused on for this particular resource was the kind of golden age of publishing in the 19th century. I have this question. I don't know, Lindsay, if we can try and kind of tackle this together. So there's a question about what we do with uncut pages and with materials that are embedded in the text. And this particular person is also amused that we have to explain cut and paste function, because some of us still have our old X-Acto knives. That's a really interesting anecdote. So Lindsay, do you have anything to say about uncut pages or materials embedded in texts?
Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely come across uncut pages in the archive, it would always be, the conservation is always very much led by the archive and what they feel is best for their collection. In the majority of cases, we would never cut those pages if they haven't already been cut. So it may be that we then add some metadata to the finalized record, just so that the person looking at those images is aware of why you may skip over some of the pages in the digital scans. When it comes to materials embedded in the text, I wonder, is that kind of referencing additional materials that have been glued in? Because if so, that's something we see quite a lot, actually.
You could probably, I'm not quite sure, but you could maybe speak to that. Maybe that will answer the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's quite often, as I say, that we'll see kind of additional papers that have been glued in. If there is any flexibility to kind of lift those or move those, we would ensure that every kind of different iteration of the page is captured as a digital image, to ensure that somebody using those images has a very similar experience that they would have in the archive, of being able to kind of lift that flap of paper and see the text underneath. But again, if it was fully stuck down, unless the archive specifically wanted to, we would never alter
that. He's just specified as well that he meant glued in, so you were absolutely right in how you interpreted that, but also tucked in and interleaved. So do you think tucked in or interleaved would be different from glued in?
Oh yes, absolutely. If something has been kind of tucked in between the pages, generally we would scan that in situ first. So again, the person looking at the images would be able to kind of see this is how it would have appeared in the archive, and then we would generally remove that tucked in piece of paper or leaf or piece of fabric, as we've sometimes found, and then that would be captured separately as well.
Amazing, thank you so much. So we have a kind of a related question about how much of the about kind of the digitization of the Byron Papers and how much of them have been digitized in the 19th century literary society, and the kind of relationship we had with the Murray Archive on from that point of view.
Sorry, was that how much of the Byron Papers were digitized? It's quite, sorry.
Yeah, I think maybe we can kind of reframe that question a little bit, just to talk about the kind of how we approach more generally the digitization in the context of the John Murray Archive.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of the development of the project took place over several years. And the development team at Adam Matthew, they worked very, very closely with an editorial board of experts who have worked very closely with the collection, and in particular with David Maclay and other figures at the library. And they were able very much to kind of lead us and steer us in the items that we would include for digitisation to ensure that we kind of had a real breadth of the different types of material included in the archive, and also kind of really captured the essence of that kind of 19th century golden era. And yes, the vast majority of the Byron Papers were captured on that advice.
The person thanks for that response. So we have a question about, so one master's student got in touch with us about who's intending to do their thesis about John Murray II, and there's a question about where to get started. And I think because I'm in the outreach team and I support students with their research, this is probably something that we can kind of have a talk about afterwards. So if it's okay with you, I'll kind of get in touch with you over email, and we can see how to get kind of best started with your master's research using the collection and finding more scholarship. We do include secondary essays as well, and by academics in the database, and you can have a free trial of the collection for a period to kind of have a read through those, and those kind of very much frame from a scholarly point of view some of the main themes and areas of research about John Murray and that archive. There's a question about whether, Lindsay, about the quarterly review and anonymously published articles, and whether the Murray Archive included identification of that. That's quite a specific question. I don't know if you know off the top of your head an answer to that.
I can't say I do know off the top of my head, sorry. I think that might be one to come back to if we could get in touch later.
Yeah, we'll get in touch with you. And I think the same person also had a question about Mary Robinson in Perdita manuscripts. Her kind of vague, I don't want to say out loud because I'm worried that I'm misremembering. So maybe we'll get back in touch with you over email about the quarterly review and about Mary Robinson in Perdita manuscripts, and get those kind of more detailed questions answered for you. And we have a question from a librarian about whether we could whether we can share our slides or link to the slides with staff and students working on book history. I actually I know you, so I'll email you afterwards and share those PowerPoint slides with you. I don't think that should be a problem. Let me just, sorry, I'm just reading. So there's a question about travel writing in the John Murray archive. I'm loving how kind of like everyone seems to have very specific and kind of detailed understanding already of what they're looking for in this collection, which is amazing to hear. But there's someone is sharing this story about Murray having a contract with the Navy and publishing pioneering Arctic travel writing, and they're wondering whether this is included in the resource. Again, I don't know if you know this, Lindsay, off the top of your head, but we could maybe speak little bit about all the travel writing as well that's contained in 19th century literary society.
Oh gosh, I fear if I start talking about the travel writing in this project, I won't shut up. It's a really fantastic theme and element within the resource. Murray's worked with so many wonderful pioneering authors, and yes, they published the Navy List, I believe it was called, and there will be kind of reams of information, particularly in the sales material, which kind of covers the publication of the Navy List. I wonder if it was Franklin who was the polar explorer, and there is some materials included on Franklin, yes, and I'd be very happy to kind of dig those out and kind of provide a more specific answer on that later. But yes, so much wonderful material on travel writers. My very favourite travel writer is included actually Isabella Bird or Isabella Bishop, who I guess if there's time, perhaps I can come back to her.
And it's also worth probably noting out that we have also published a collection called Age of Exploration, which you can also have a free trial to, or you might already have access to that through your library. And Age of Exploration has a huge amount of material relating to the exploration of the Arctic, if you're interested in that. So those two collections might work in really interesting ways, and in terms of the kind of dialogue that might be in between those two collections. And there's another request for the slides, and I'll get back in touch with you as well about the slides and the kind of the more detailed questions that you asked earlier. And that's everything that I can see right now. Let me just give 1 second to see if there's any more that come in. Perhaps you could speak a little bit more about Isabella Bird, because I know how much you love her, and just why is Isabella Bird so exciting? Tell us.
Oh gosh, well, there's wonderful stories about her relationship with the Murrays in particular. For example, I think one reviewer kind of made a comment on the way she dressed, and potentially the fact that she was dressing in a masculine fashion. And it's really hard to find a specific citation of this, but supposedly she ordered John Murray to thrash the reviewer on her behalf. She was plagued with illness from a very young age, and doctors advised Isabella to kind of take the fresh air to heal herself. And she really took this idea and ran with it. So first she visited Canada and the USA, so saw the Rocky Mountains and Hawaii, but then she went further afield to China and Korea, Persia, Morocco as well, I think. And often this was by herself with just a local guide and a revolver hidden under her skirts. So I'm just absolutely in awe of her ability to throw herself into adventures. And also the photographs that she took on her travels, they're, some of my favorite images in the entire collection.
And I think given that we're kind of all missing travel very much, this might be one of the ways that we can kind of vicariously still explore the world through her writings and photographs. And that feels like, since we're kind of on the hour, feels like a really nice place to end the session. So I just wanted to say that if you have any more questions, or you want a free trial of 19th Century Literary Society or any other collection that we've discussed today, please feel free to get in touch with us at info@amdigital.co.uk. And thank you again for all of you for joining us today, and happy World Book Day 2021. And I hope you all stay safe and enjoy the rest of your day.